Welcome to the next part of our teaching series on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 to 7. And today we'll be looking at reflecting God's character. Beginning with Matthew 4:17. From that time Jesus began to preach and to say, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Jesus begins his public ministry in Galilee by announcing the kingdom of heaven. He calls the first disciples, some fishermen, and they become part of the 12 apostles representing Israel, the new Israel that is to be formed. And he demonstrates the kingdom through miracles, through powers. He sets people free, heals people. He shows that the kingdom has come, God's reign has come. And then he teaches, and we see this in chapters 5 to 7. He teaches, he gives the law of the kingdom. Matthew 5:17, it says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill." And Jesus begins with the blessings, with the Beatitudes as we know them. And he ends with the two house builders, one who builds on rock and one who builds on sand. The one who builds on rock is the one who hears and does. Discipleship is a call to freedom from bondage, freedom from sin, and to obedience, to allegiance with God, to live with God and for God. So what does that mean? Let's look again at the Beatitudes. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." The blessing of God is for the meek, it's for the weak, those who have nothing to bring of themselves, who just come because they recognize their need for God, those who seek God's rule of peace in their lives, God's shalom, not their own advantage, but God's peace. And the blessed ones are characterized by their obedience to God and their dependence on God. Their obedience to God and their dependence on God. It's not about self-sufficiency. It's not about what we can do, what they can do, the disciples. It's about depending on God. And therefore disciples have nothing to boast about because their righteousness doesn't come from them, it comes from God. And they do not judge others. They don't seek commendation and reward from others. All these issues will be addressed in the course of the sermon. Judgment, reward. But disciples reflect God's character inwardly, not just outwardly, not just through outward works, but inwardly, a change of the heart. They depend on God's grace, not on their own efforts. Their righteousness comes from Him, from His grace. Well, we'd think they should be popular, but actually choosing God's way brings conflict with the world. A world that wants to rule itself, that wants to do its own thing, go its own way. So the way of the righteous, the way of the disciple is a lonely way, just like the way of Jesus, the way of the cross. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." As the prophets challenged Israel's apostasy, the disciples challenged their world. And not just in word, but in deed. They make a difference by who they are. They call to make a difference by who they are, not just by what they say. Not like the religious hypocrites who tell others how to be, what to do, while not doing it themselves, not living up to their own commandments, their own rules. The church throughout history has been very good at campaigning for righteousness while living in sin. But It's about reflecting God's righteousness, reflecting God's kingdom in the world, in a hostile world. Jesus says in Matthew 5:13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." Salt affects everything that it touches. It adds taste, it preserves. It can even be used for disinfection, healing, because it kills pathogens, germs. But how can salt lose its flavor? Salt is salt. It has flavor by virtue of the fact that it's salt. It's salty. So how can it lose its flavor? Well, the only way actually salt can lose its flavor, and we have to remember in those days salt was an expensive commodity. It's very cheap for us nowadays in the supermarkets. But it could be mixed, stretched, mixed, diluted with other substances to increase profit. And obviously it would lose flavor. Too much of the world in the church makes the church become the world, takes away the flavor, takes away what the church should be affecting, how the church should be affecting the world. But what is worldliness? What does worldliness actually mean? It's not so much about outward things like the Pharisees. They paid a lot of attention to the outward things, and Jesus repeatedly rebuked them for that. But it's an inward matter, a matter of the heart. Worldliness begins in the heart. It's out of the issues of the heart that the life comes, our speech comes, everything we do comes. That's what Jesus means when he says, "Unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." And Jesus goes on to give examples of keeping the Torah from the heart, inward observance of the law. In the Beatitudes, he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Who can ascend to the mountain of the Lord? He who has clean hands and a pure heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Jesus then goes on to compare the disciples with light. He says, "You are the light of the world." You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. You are the light of the world. Light comes from God. He is light. Jesus came into the world as the light of the world. And it's his presence in the believer that shines through the believer, that makes the believer, that makes God's disciples, God's people, the church, his light in the world. And therefore the glory belongs to God. All the glory goes to God. Believers point to God. But light needs to be seen. It can't be hidden away. It must be seen, but not to draw attention to the carrier, to the light bearer, but to point to God, the one who shines through the believer. God's light is reflected through attitude, not just through deeds. It's the attitude, the motivation. And so Paul, writing from prison, a letter of joy, he keeps mentioning joy and rejoicing. Even though he's in chains, he looks up to Jesus and he thanks him for the opportunity. He's grateful for the opportunity to share the gospel, even with the soldiers keeping him prisoner, guarding him. And he writes in Philippians 2:14 to the believers in Philippi, "Do all things without complaining and disputing," a matter of the heart, a matter of attitude. "Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless or innocent, children of God, without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain." Paul had sown into their lives. He'd given them the gospel, and now he was looking. He knew that God was looking for them to reflect his glory in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, in the midst of a world that doesn't know God. Really, in this passage, there are two analogies. The light of the world. There are two analogies, a lamp and a city. Let's look at the city first. Well, does cities in those days have street lights so that they would be lit up? Nowadays you can see from far when you approach a city or a town, you can see the street lights, you can see the lights from the houses. Probably not as much, but there might have been some of that. But a city on a hill is exalted, elevated, can be seen from far. Could that be a reference to Jerusalem, the exalted city of God? Last time we looked at Isaiah chapter 2. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This, of course, is a prophecy of the future kingdom of God, when Jesus, the Messiah, reigns from Jerusalem over all the world. A kingdom of righteousness, a kingdom of peace, of shalom, God's rest. One day that will come. But meanwhile, in the meantime, it is present in the world, visible through the followers of Jesus, through the disciples. True disciples who live, true followers who live by the law of the kingdom, empowered by God's grace, not by their own works, their own efforts, their own ability, but by God's grace, by his Spirit working in them and through them. That's why Jesus, in the model prayer that he gives, says, of course this is mentioned as well in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, Matthew chapter 6. Jesus will teach them to say, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. God's kingdom, God's reign come, first in us, first in the believer, and through the believer it is seen by the world, and the world comes just as the nations one day will come to Jerusalem and the law will go forth from Jerusalem. A light, a lamp. Where do you put a lamp? You put it somewhere where it can shine, where it can be visible. You don't hide it under a basket or under a table. You put it somewhere where it will illuminate the whole room. One light in the middle of the room makes the whole light change from darkness to light. The whole room change from darkness to light. As God's reign is established, as his kingdom is established in the hearts of the believers, God's character is reflected through them. By his Spirit, he writes his law in their hearts. He puts it in their minds. That's what Jeremiah prophesied about the new covenant. God will write his law in their hearts by his Spirit. That's why Jesus can say, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. This righteousness is a deeper righteousness of the heart. It's not just outward works, but a change, a reflection of God's character. Next time we'll look at the following verses where Jesus talks about fulfilling the law. How does Jesus fulfill the law? What does it mean that he fulfilled the law? Meantime, may the Lord bless you.